Hi, Dr. Rubin. Good afternoon. And if you would, you could change your name or rename yourself rather. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Sorry, I've been going from one meeting to the next.
That is the way it is these days.
Yeah.
Chat. So we have about another minute. All righty. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 2 o'clock. Welcome to part 3 of our COVID-19 series on moral distress and advanced directives. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Becky Baird, and I am the Director of Faculty Development at the University of Texas College of Nursing and Health Innovation. This spring, the College of Nursing collaborated with UTA's School of Social Work to provide a series of interdisciplinary conversations on COVID-19. Part 1 included dialogue highlighting disparities, that health equity is still not a reality as COVID-19 has unequally affected many racial and ethnic minority groups. For part 2, last responders and end-of-life care community leaders provided insight into how the pandemic affected themselves and their services. Before we begin part 3, I will share some continuing education housekeeping slides. And I'm working on, there we are. Okay. So for our participants out there, we had some pre-work, and the pre-work will provide 1.0 contact hour or 1.0 CEU for a total of 3.0 contact hours for the nurses and 3.0 CEUs for the social workers. So I'm going to take just a few moments. We have a QR code here that if you have an iPhone or an iPad, you've got a built-in QR code scanner, and you can scan the code to get the request for the pre-work, which will be sent out to you after the activity, which is okay. All righty. And I know for Android phones, you have to open up the app and whatnot. But if you need the pre-work, got that on the next, oops, sorry. Pre-work, if the QR code does not work, becky.baird@uta.edu, becky.baird@uta.edu. Okay, so the University of Texas at Arlington College of Nursing and Health Innovation is accredited as a provider of nursing continuing professional development by the American Nurses Credentialing Commission on accreditation. The University of Texas at Arlington School of Social Work is authorized to provide CEUs for the social workers. Today's activity, the nurse planner, myself, has determined that no one who has the ability to control the content of this NCPD activity, the planning committee, members, or presenters, has a conflict of interest. The UTA College of Nursing and Health Innovation is providing the activity, and the UTA School of Social Work participated in the joint planning of this activity. Today's activity has received no commercial support. So how to receive your continuing education credits. So you'll complete the pre-work, and as I mentioned, that can be done after the fact if you did not receive the pre-work. And you can email me, becky.baird@uta.edu. You have joined the live virtual presentation for the entire, and will do so for the entire activity. We do have a Q&A session at the end of today's activity, and if active participation in the discussion, and then you will complete and submit a post-activity evaluation. And towards the end of today's activity, we will have a QR code for you to scan for the evaluation, and we will also put the link to the evaluation in the chat board. So today's learning outcome, 85% of the participants will report that this activity provides information that enhances, validates, or causes a change in practice. For nursing CNE questions, my email is listed. And for social work CEU questions, my colleague Tracy Orwig, and she is tracy.orwig@uta.edu. So the certificate of successful completion, the evaluation link will remain open through Tuesday afternoon, May 4th at 5 p.m. And Tracy and I will be emailing certificates within 2 weeks. So 2 weeks from today. All right. So at this time, it is my pleasure and honor to pass the dialogue to Dr. Sophia Fantis, UTA School of Social Work and moderator for today's activity. Thank you, Dr. Fantis.
Thank you so much, Becky, and hello to all our panelists and our attendees. Thank you so much for joining us this rainy Friday afternoon to talk about the joys of moral distress and advanced care planning. I know this is not a light subject for Friday, so I really appreciate all of you being here, and I'm really hoping that we all have a lot to learn from each of our panelists who come from a wide range of professional backgrounds and have a lot of experience and expertise on this topic. I know that many of you obviously saw the pre-work and have done the pre-work. Before we introduce our panelists, I just want to make sure that we're all sort of on the same page. You know, COVID-19 has dramatically, transformed and changed and shifted our conversations around end-of-life care and advanced care planning, and as well as heightened experiences of moral distress. And for many of us, we have these ideas of what advanced care planning is, what an advanced directive is. Maybe we have ideas about what moral distress is. And really, I'm just going to provide you with a very, very quick definition and sort of terms to make sure that we're all sort of on the same page. And then we can kind of build on that into our discussion. And so that everybody kind of has an understanding of what we're talking about. So I think you can all see my screen and see my PowerPoint. But the Texas Advanced Directives Act. So when we talk about advanced directives, I think many of us often think of that living will, right? That directive to physicians. But actually the Texas Advanced Directives Act has 3 different components. There's the medical power of attorney, there's the directive to physicians, and then there's the out of hospital do not resuscitate order, or DNR order. I'm not going to go too much into the last one, but I do want to talk very, very briefly about what a medical power of attorney is and what a directive to physician is, so that when we talk about advanced directives, we have that in the back of our mind. So a medical power of attorney, for those who may not know, designates a person to make decisions on your behalf. You sign it when you have capacity to make that medical decision, and it's only used when you're unable to make medical decisions for yourself. So we would never turn to a medical power of attorney if you're able to make medical decisions regarding any sort of intervention on your own. And a terminal or irreversible condition is not required. So you can use a medical power of attorney for routine care decisions, for things like an X-ray or an MRI or anything related to that. It does not have to be sort of end of life withdrawal or life-sustaining care or anything related to that. And the reason that we have medical powers of attorney is that there is a surrogate decision-making hierarchy in Texas if you don't have the capacity to make medical decisions. And if you don't have a spouse or you don't want somebody under this hierarchy to be making medical decisions on your behalf, that there is somebody else in your life who you trust, who knows what your end of life wishes are, then you would have a medical power of attorney. So in Texas, very briefly, there's two different acts. There's the Consent to Medical Treatment Act, which is routine medical decisions, and then the Texas Advanced Directives Act hierarchy, which is more of those end of life conversations about the withdrawal or life-sustaining interventions. And as you can see, I'm not going to go too into this, but as you can see that there's the medical power of attorney would be that first person that we turn to in regards to these decisions. And then after that would be the patient's spouse, adult child with the waiver and consent of other adult children, the majority of adult children, the patient's parents, and then any individual identified to act for the patient's nearest living relative. And then if it's a Jane or John Doe, if it's somebody that we don't know, have any family or any close relatives or anything like that, we actually turn to a member of the clergy. And we have a chaplain with us today who works on the palliative care team with Texas Health, who's going to talk to us a little bit about the role of a chaplain in making these sort of routine medical decisions. Now, if it's end of life or life-sustaining interventions, that looks a little different. And obviously you can see from the slide, it's an attending physician and the spouse, adult children, parents, nearest living relative, or what we often call the 2-doc rule, where it's the attending physician and then another doctor who's not affiliated with the case in any way. I'm happy to answer any questions related to this at the end, but we're going to move very quickly into a little bit about the medical power of attorney's responsibilities. So they can't be a healthcare provider or residential care provider or employee or anything related to that. And they can't consent to anything related to voluntary inpatient mental health services, ECT, psychosurgery, abortion, or the omission of care primarily intended to relieve pain. So they can't deny pain medications for individuals. They can't take that away because it is the duty and the obligation of a physician to relieve pain and suffering for patients and their families. And so what are the standards that a surrogate decision maker uses? Why do we have medical powers of attorney? What do we look for in a good surrogate decision maker? One is substituted judgment. So they use the previously expressed wishes, values, preferences of the patient in order to make the best decision moving forward. Or they use the best interest standards. It's what an average rational person would want in the best interest of the patient if they don't know what the patient would have wanted before or have never had those conversations before, which is why this panel is so important, so that if we ever rely on surrogate decision makers, they can use substituted judgment, that we have these conversations about what we would want at end of life. The second is directive to physicians. So this advises the physician about what your wishes for levels of treatment. In order to use a directive to physician or a living will, you have to be diagnosed with a terminal or irreversible condition and obviously unable to make medical decisions for yourself. You lack the capacity to do so. So you turn to a directive to physician when you can't turn to that patient individually and know what they would want and have that conversation with them. So I use terminal and irreversible condition a lot. What does this mean for those who may not know? A terminal condition is an incurable condition caused by injury, disease, or illness that, according to medical judgment, will produce death within 6 months, even with life-sustaining treatment. An irreversible condition is a condition, injury, or illness that can never be cured, that leaves the person unable to care for or make decisions for themselves, and is fatal without life-sustaining treatment. And then the last is the out-of-hospital DNR, and this obviously directs health professionals acting in an out-of-hospital setting. So like the emergency room, the community, or hospital outpatient departments. And it can be executed on behalf of an incompetent patient by a physician or surrogate. And it's usually identified by a bracelet or necklace, never a tattoo, if you all know that story. That is not acceptable. But that is something that is often signed by individuals if they don't want to be resuscitated. Let's say if they have a heart attack on a sidewalk or anything related to that outside of a hospital admission. Now, I went through this very, very quickly, but obviously these conversations have shifted now with COVID-19, with visitation policies being put in place, with patients going on ventilators very, very quickly and unable to communicate with doctors and physicians and allied health professionals. A lot of things have shifted and changed. And this has had undeniable impacts on the way in which allied healthcare professionals, ethicists, physicians have these conversations with patient and families. And what can happen is disagreements can happen and ethical issues can arise. And this can really heighten experiences of moral distress. And very briefly, moral distress arises as a result of an ethical dilemma. So if an ethical dilemma happens and it's resolved, when the resolved action fails to align with your individual moral judgment, so something has happened, the ethical issue has been resolved, and the person says, and the physician, the allied health professional says, I feel like what we did was wrong. I feel like we didn't take the correct route. The action that we could have taken wasn't the right thing to do. That is that feeling of moral distress. It's also that icky feeling that I have, but it's a value conflict, right? It's your own personal and professional values of the individual versus those structural and clinical context of the hospital. So those actions can't be executed due to institutional constraints. So for the social workers in the room, things like discharge planning, I'm sure come to mind for you, right? When that patient can't go to that right long-term care facility, right? That right rehabilitation center based on institutional constraints. For the other social workers in the room, things like length of stay. When you have a lot of pressure to discharge a patient before you think that they are able to be discharged or it's a safe discharge plan, but you're getting sort of those institutional structural constraints put upon you, that can result in moral distress. And what happens when moral distress isn't resolved or isn't talked about or addressed, something happens called moral residue. So that moral distress builds and builds over time, and this can have a lasting impact. And it's often indicative of deeper systemic problems. And why do we want to talk about moral distress, right? So vaccinations are happening. We kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel, hopefully, with this pandemic. But what we have to remember is that the grief, the suffering, the moral distress has long-lasting implications for years on our providers and on those working in the healthcare system. And so some of those long-term implications of moral distress that we have to think about are those negative impacts on quality of patient care, job efficiency and satisfaction, disengagement from patients and work, things like burnout, compassion fatigue, feeling jaded. So oftentimes when we talk about moral distress, we kind of think about it in relation to occupational stress or burnout. But moral distress can cause burnout and occupational stress. They're not the same thing. And it can also lead to increased turnover rates, working fewer hours, financial strain on the hospital, frustration, anger, sadness, and guilt, as well as physical elements, so like stomach aches, headaches, heart palpitations, things like that people have talked about. So these are real important issues that we want to get into and that our panelists are going to talk about in terms of institutional strategies to alleviate and address moral distress, especially in the time of COVID. So without further ado, I know that was quick. I hope we are all on the same page in terms of understanding sort of where we're coming from and what we're going to talk about today. And so as the moderator, I just want to sort of start introducing our panelists. So Gabriella, I'm wondering if you can unmute yourself and just introduce yourself, a little bit about your role within the hospital and how you see sort of that conversation around advanced directives and how that connects to what you do within the hospital setting.
Good afternoon. My name is Gabriella Whitener. I'm a clinical assistant professor at UTA, and I'm a bedside nurse in a medical ICU in a very busy hospital in Dallas-Fort Worth area, where that has been transformed as a COVID unit for more than a year. So just like Sophia said, the shift from having these discussions about goals of care during COVID have simply been augmented by rapid changes and deteriorations in the patient status and the unknown that had to be solved, and the decisions had to be made on a very fast pace. If simply before these conversations had some time, or maybe a different type of background, with COVID, we were faced day in and day out with the decision of should we resuscitate, should we intubate, should we end of life decision that the families were totally not prepared to make. And I don't know if anybody is aware, but we do have 4 million nurses in the United States that have been involved at different levels with COVID patients. And American Nursing Association had a large initiative where the motto that a healthy nurse will be providing and take care of a healthy nation. So we had to take care of the nurses also to be able to restrict and prevent the impact of the moral distress, and of course of the moral residual distress, that because dealing with these issues every day were putting nurses in a very different position, and they were experiencing burnout, and simply were dramatic changes in health and in their ability to provide high quality and standard according to the standards of care. So at the hospital where I work, we had an initiative for a remembrance tree. A remembrance tree where we simply took our Christmas tree, and instead of hanging the lights and all the decorations, we invited every nurse to hang a white ribbon significant of maybe in memory of those who we lost, not only family and friends, co-workers, but also for those who we took care of, and they were not able to make it through these difficult times. And also encourage nurses to start taking care of them. And we raised awareness of mindfulness exercises, where they brought the attention in a moment on themselves and were non-judgmental of what was going on, around, and they had enhanced sense of their thoughts, sensations, and emotions, and focused on their own breathing. Actually, mindfulness is helps prevent the lower impact of the distress, and it helped the nurses to avoid being caught in automatic reactions or negative judgments. Having a free mind and being non-judgmental helped presenting cases with professionalism and explaining maybe the crude reality of what was going on with the patients to family members. And let's not forget, we did that through via phone and FaceTime. We had to adjust and transform our ways of communicating to families, and through distance conversations, and had to be to make them understand what was going on.
Thank you, Gabrielle. I really appreciate you bringing in your institution and the things that you've done to remember those who have passed from COVID-19. Emily, I'm hoping you can introduce yourself next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Emily. I work here at Texas Health in Fort Worth. I am privileged to be part of our palliative care team, both in our adult world and in the neonatal intensive care unit. So we get to do a lot of conversations with families during the COVID pandemic. Have been the primary chaplain for our main COVID ICU. So seeing a lot of those patients and talking with their families a lot. That's me. You just wanted me to introduce myself, right?
Yeah, thanks, Emily. I'll go to you for our first question, don't you worry. Jeannie, do you want to go next?
Hi, everybody. I'm Jeannie Rosenblum. I'm a social worker on the palliative care team in the adult world at Texas Health Fort Worth. And certainly our team has seen our share of COVID patients and this moral distress amongst our team, the patients, their families, and the staff at large in the hospital. And there have been a lot of different initiatives here that we're eager to share to help with that distress.
Thank you so much. We're looking forward to hearing from your perspective as well. Dr. Rubin, you are muted.
Sorry, I was working last night. I'm Michael Rubin. I'm a critical care neurologist. I'm also a clinical ethicist, and I chair the ethics committee at UT Southwestern. Part of our work as an ethics committee also includes a staff support model that we call Nomad. So I hope to contribute to this conversation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rubin. And Dr. Malik, last but not least.
Hi, everyone. My name is Janet Malik. I'm a faculty member in the Center for Medical Ethics and Health Policy at Baylor College of Medicine. And I'm also the director of the biomedical ethics program at Houston Methodist. My background is in philosophy, so I can't ever claim to have been in your shoes providing direct patient care, but I always knew that I wanted to go into bioethics. I think the piece of my work that is the most relevant for this conversation is the time that I have spent as a clinical ethicist. We have a consultation service where anybody in the hospital can feel free to call and ask any sort of ethics related question, and a consultant responds hopefully within 10 or 15 minutes and tries to help them work through those kind of problems. So COVID has obviously raised some new and difficult challenges, and it also has raised some very familiar ones, like the ones that Dr. Fantas was talking about with surrogate decision-making, end of life care decision-making, and things like that.
Thank you so much to everybody. And so to start our conversation, you know, I brought up that surrogate hierarchy. I brought up the importance of advanced directives and having these conversations. And as you could see from the hierarchy, if somebody doesn't have a medical power of attorney or a loved one nearby or anything related to that, we often turn to a chaplain. And so Emily, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what is that process if somebody doesn't have an advanced directive, and has that changed with COVID-19, especially with considering visitation policies and the inability to kind of connect as easily as perhaps before with patients, families, and loved ones?
I think the big challenge with COVID is that it hits quickly and hard, and folks are not able to have these conversations when they're sick. The healthy people that are coming down with COVID and becoming so ill, they've not really thought too much about their healthcare wishes or what they would want. And so being sort of faced with your mortality in this really urgent way is a very challenging environment to try to have conversation with your family over the phone or over a video. And so what we really try to rely on, I think, in our palliative team especially, is asking families, if there's not an advanced directive, if there's not that written documentation from your loved one, think about who they are as a person. Think about what they enjoy, what they do with their time. And if we're telling you that these challenges are before them for the remainder of their life, or they may die, do you think that they would be comfortable proceeding with this and this and this? And so it's sort of a more emotional, I think, and spiritual thing to ask families to really consider their loved one and what they are really like. And they're the best ones to do that. Just seems really hard to have to think about it in those ways. The other piece, I think, that can be challenging is not having these conversations in person. But there's been periods of time, I think, during our kind of isolation or quarantine that people have gotten really good at talking on the phone and being really open and honest in a different way. We found lots of families really pouring their hearts and souls out on the phone and having some really incredible encounters because they're also feeling that isolation. And so having someone really reach out and open space for them, even over the phone, has been a really powerful connection. So in that way too, I think human beings are capable of going over these obstacles and being able to speak for their loved one, or, you know, reach out and connect in an emotional way, despite the challenges that we're dealing with. Sometimes it's been an incredible thing to bear witness to.
I appreciate that. And Jeannie, you know, I saw you kind of nodding along. And so I'm wondering what your perspective as a social worker is, and I'm sure we have some social work students on this panel, what your involvement is in terms of having and initiating these conversations about end-of-life plans, advanced care planning with families, especially during the pandemic.
I think our jobs are very similar. We cover much of the same ground. The chaplains from a more spiritual place and the social workers from a more family systems place. It was particularly difficult for families not to be there. And like Emily, we experienced families bursting into tears on the phone, pouring out their hearts, wanting us to, you know, do special things for the patient because they can't be there. That was really hard. One thing on our team, Emily and I were talking about yesterday, is that we never made those phone calls alone. It was just too much for one person. We always did it in pairs. Things changed and morphed a little bit as the pandemic went on, and there was a little more flexibility in visitation, and people could see their loved ones through the mirror or after a long period of time when they no longer tested positive for the virus.
And, you know, in picking up on what you said, I want to go to something that Janet had said before about, you know, having these conversations around surrogate decision making. And so obviously, you know, Emily and Jeannie, you've talked about how families are, you know, they just want that connection, right? And they're okay to talk about it. And so what happens if a family says, you know, I don't know, we've never talked about this. I don't know what their previously expressed wishes are. This all came, especially during the pandemic, right? This all came very suddenly and very quickly. I'm dealing with a lot of grief and bereavement around what this is happening. How do you initiate that dialogue and try and get a sense of who that person was to make these type of decisions with substituted judgment? So Jen, I'm wondering if you can touch on that as a clinical ethicist.
That's a good question. Like Emily said earlier, we try and explore with the family what the patient was like before they got sick. Were they independent? Were they fiercely independent? Did they like to get help from people? Did they enjoy eating? What were the activities that they liked to do? And kind of come at it from having families make decisions based on the patient's personal characteristics and likes. Yeah.
And Janet, from a clinical ethicist perspective, because I know, for those who may not know, I did my postdoc in clinical ethics at Houston Methodist. And so I know that we've had many of these conversations of families saying, I don't know, we've never talked about it, right? It was not something we ever talked about. We, you know, it was always kind of a taboo subject. I guess my two questions are, one, how do you then have that conversation with families as an ethicist? And two, have you noticed that that's changed with COVID? Are people talking about it more? Are people having those conversations and engaged in those conversations more? Because it feels so sort of in our faces, I will say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So I don't know that that's a good question. I don't think that people are necessarily talking about it that much more. I wish that they would be, but that hasn't been my experience anyway. And talking to families, they still seem completely unprepared, and understandably so. I think the way that we try to get at, we ask them questions. We don't say like, what are your values, or what are your, what are your husband's values? We walk around it and kind of say, tell me, as one of our colleagues at Baylor likes to say, what did a good day look like before he got sick? Trying to get that. Have you heard that before? That's Trevor's favorite. If before COVID, I would try to get them to show me pictures on their phone, just to kind of talk a little bit about like who that person is and what they do, what they did. One phrase I often use is to say, if they could sit here in the room with us, what do you think they would say, about the situation? Sort of walking around it like that.
No, that's helpful. And I think those practical strategies of what exactly to ask or how to even go about saying it is really helpful for those who are attending and for understanding, because it can be such an awkward question, I think, and can be so taboo. That's why people don't talk about it. So it feels awkward in the room to bring it up. And Dr. Rubin, I'm wondering if you can talk about, your role on the ethics committee, and when does an ethics committee get involved in sort of these advanced directives or advanced care planning, and what does that sort of look like?
So our committee gets involved more often when there is a disagreement about an existing advanced directive. And if the way that a patient's care is proceeding seems incongruent with a known advanced directive, we may get involved to try to find an understanding of why there's such a disagreement and to resolve that discrepancy. And, a lot of times it comes from simply the fact that an advanced directive requires that you use very generalized language because you can't anticipate every circumstance that someone's going to be in. And so to me, the real advantage to an advanced directive is it forces a conversation. It requires that you sit down with your family and talk about the things that are important to you, what you might want to do in certain circumstances. It's not ordering off a menu that you hand it to your physician and they execute the plan as written. It's more of, let's get a generalized sense of what someone might want in particular circumstances. And I would agree with what Janet said about lack of preparation. I think people that have not felt a sense of mortality, that don't feel they're at risk, they don't think about these things. And so really the only people that are prepared for how to decide with a COVID illness are those that have earned a few years, those that have faced illness. Otherwise, younger folks don't think that they're really at significant risk, so they haven't talked about those things. And the challenge to all of this is that we change how we view the world. We change what we're willing to tolerate as we advance, as we have experiences. And so someone who is otherwise healthy might eagerly say, I would never want anything if I got sick, until they actually get sick. And then all of a sudden they're saying, well, maybe I could live with that. And so that is the biggest challenge if families have not had these conversations.
Thank you so much. I think you did a great job in terms of sort of explaining that. And as I watch our panelists, I see Emily and Jeannie kind of nod and look at each other. And so I want to pick up on that because obviously you connected with what Dr. Rubin was saying in terms of these conversations. And so do you have anything to add or anything that you want to contribute to that?
I think too, with what Dr. Malik said, asking a family member, what is your loved one's values? Eat your vegetables, like drink enough milk. Like, I don't know what I would even fathom as my parents' values, but asking more about like who they really are as a person or what is a good day for them. That was a good question. What do they like? What do they like to do? Yeah.
I think in ethics, we run across, a lot of times what we run across, it seems like, is what the patient's family wants to do and what the physicians think is appropriate might not match.
Yeah. And I think too that people don't realize, I think especially maybe unique to COVID too, patients don't seem to realize how sick they are sometimes. And I know Gabrielle has probably seen some of that too. Of you look at someone's oxygen saturations on the monitor and it's so low, but they're sitting and thinking they're fine. They feel fine. So even when they're sitting in the ICU and about to be intubated, they may not really be faced with that question of their own mortality because they don't feel as sick as they really are, which is cause it's a really bizarre situation and ultimately really difficult for families to understand as well.
And even I think our aggressive care seems so routine to families. Emily and I were in a meeting yesterday where the family said, you're not doing anything. And we had to re-educate them on what the ventilator was doing and what the medications were doing, and what the suctioning was doing. And
it's a lot of education.
Yeah, that sounds like it in terms of a lot of education, which might lead into some of those disagreements that Dr. Rubin brought up and that you brought up. And that I wonder, and I'll point this to Janet and then ask others, but has COVID-19 heightened disagreements between healthcare teams and patients and families when it comes to advanced care plans? And if so, how? I can imagine that distance, right? That physical distance, that emotional distance might heighten those disagreements and the communication that's able to happen. But what have you witnessed as an ethicist in the hospital, and especially in Houston, where we saw numbers just grow dramatically and exponentially?
Yeah, I do think that we've had more really, really challenging disagreements, in large part caused by the fact that they're not allowing the families to come in and see the patients. So the doctor reports, what they're seeing, and the family kind of has to either see them through an iPad, or it's very different. Sometimes we will, when there's like a really challenging case, we will allow them to come in and like look from the window, and then that can like change the way that they're thinking about it. It helps them to really understand how badly off their loved one is. I think the other thing is that because this is affecting people who are otherwise healthy, there's no preparation. As we kind of said earlier, like he walked into the hospital just fine, and now you're telling me he's going to die? Like that doesn't compute. And so the process of grieving takes so much longer, and there's no preparation for it, that I think families just want to continue to push to do everything, beyond what the doctors are thinking is reasonable. I think there's also one interesting piece though here, especially related to COVID, which is sort of the opposite, which is like in New York, when it first hit there, they were mostly able to avoid like real in-your-face triage because they were very aggressive with advanced care planning. They were like talking to patients as they walked in the hospital, like, do you want to be intubated if this doesn't go well? And I think in part because a lot of the patients were older, they were coming from nursing homes. A lot of them said, no, I don't actually want that. And they were able to allocate the resources to the patients who wanted them. And, we have colleagues who we work with in New York, and they actually really credit that process of having those conversations as making things go better in New York than they otherwise would have. So I think it can be on both sides of the coin there.
No, I appreciate that. And, Gabriella, as a nurse, what are some of the things you've witnessed in terms of bringing up these advanced care plans and these conversations with patients, especially at the bedside with families who can't be there and they're looking at their loved one through an iPad, through FaceTime? What was that like for you?
I think the most difficult part of having this type of conversation were presenting the reality to the family, trying to make them understand that, when you have a relatively young relative that, yes, you may be agreed to be the medical power of attorney, thinking that this is going to happen 50 years down the road. And you're going to have those conversations maybe sometime, 40 years down the road. And now, overnight, you have to make a decision. And they even ask, so how sick are they? And then you have to explain that there is a machine for the lungs, the ventilator, there is a machine for the kidneys, the CRT, the continuous dialysis. There are medications to sustain the heart. There is, and this happened like within 24 hours when, just like you mentioned, they just entered the hospital and all of a sudden things turned south. When they need so much support, the odds of getting better are absolutely, reduced to, single numbers. And reality is created dramatic situations. It's very odd to tell somebody who, otherwise young, that their chances are very low. And it didn't only created a difficult situation for the family, but also for us trying to recognize that there is only so much we can do, that we cannot provide, we cannot save the person. And that was probably the most the highest contributing factor to the distress, to the moral distress for the nurses.
I appreciate that. And I think that really leads to my next question of how has moral distress kind of arisen based on these conversations, based on disagreements, based on watching, patients come in without, like with the family and the loved ones, like there was no forewarning, right? There was no warning. They came in, things are going downhill very, very quickly. And there's not a lot that the families can do, nor that the physicians can do, or the allied health professionals and the other care team members can do. And so this obviously connects to those experiences of moral distress. And, Dr. Rubin, I see you nodding. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you've witnessed, not specifically, but in terms of that idea of moral distress. Now it's heightened during COVID-19 as it relates to these end-of-life care decisions.
Well, I think the challenge is unique to our time. It certainly occurred in other crises, but the difference is now the healthcare provider, the nurse, the physician, they're also feeling a measure of the threat of the pandemic. So if you're a provider and you can somewhat distance yourself from the emotional experience of the patient while still being compassionate, it's a lot easier to cope with the situation. However, if you're also worried about the threat of the pandemic to your family, of you getting the disease, taking care of that patient, then the decisions that people are making that may have contributed to them coming into the hospital are going to have an emotional impact on you as a care provider. And so people can already be primed for that distress before the encounter has even occurred. And it's particularly challenging because the decision makers are also having confounding emotions where they may have a tremendous sense of guilt that the reason the person is there in the hospital is because the surrogate themselves might not have taken the precautions they should have. And so, I often, when I'm talking to residents or fellows, use analogies of being on an airplane, because I think for people in healthcare, we miss out on the experience of the patient because we're in a familiar place. But if you think what it's like to be a passenger on an airplane, you're giving a lot of trust to that pilot and the air traffic controller and saying, please keep me alive. And that's what it's like to be a patient. At some point, there's a measure of trust. And so we have to keep in mind that when we're going into that situation, we're in that plane with them when it's a disease that can affect us as well if we aren't taking the proper precautions. And so I think there has been an increase in moral distress simply by the fact that it's harder to have that assurance that you're not susceptible to what has caused this horrible illness that's affecting the patient.
I think that's a really, really great point in terms of sort of finding that balance between community risk and personal risk and trying to save patients and be involved with patients. And, you know, Emily and Jeannie, I'm wondering from your palliative care perspective, because that might be very, very different, what that sort of looks like in terms of the moral distress you're experiencing based on seeing these patients who are end of life who are COVID positive, and what that's been like for your own personal safety, but as well as the moral distress experiences among, you know, families and healthcare teams.
I think that our hospital decided very early on that chaplains, social workers, and they tried to limit how many people could go into a COVID positive room. So we've not directly spoken to COVID positive patients very much at all. The reality though is their families oftentimes were almost always infected as well. And so in times when we did allow the core visitation, there was always that big question mark of, if we meet with you, if we sit down in a conference room together with a few of you, the analogy of the plane is fitting, I think, too, because you're in an enclosed space with people that you don't know, and their emotions are high. I think the idea that you should have family members wear their mask all the time can seem so silly because they're bawling and snotty and tearful, but you don't want to get sick. But you how do you say, can you just please keep your mask on? It's, you know, stop that snotting that you're doing because it's gross and it's scary. And you like, there's that internal work I think that we all have to do of trying to stay calm and at ease within ourselves. Just there was a more work of that to do, I think, because there was this added layer of stress of, are they going to be the one to get me and my family infected?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And Jeannie, I'm wondering if you can sort of contribute, because I know, and this is my own sort of bias as being a social worker, but it's just so apparent that touch and closeness is so vital to our competencies and our social work skills. And so how has that sort of impacted not only your own role in the hospital, but your own moral distress?
So I think that's interesting that you asked that. The lack of visitors was much more difficult for us in the social work room than it was for many of the other disciplines. We were not always completely on board, and there was a conflict and moral distress among staff all over the hospital about the visitation policy, and it often differed from floor to floor or even room to room. So you hit in a very soft spot. We had lots of conversations with it, and thank goodness our team was not responsible for making that decision, because we never agreed on what the visitation should be. And aside from patient care, I think another level of trust and moral distress is those of us that all work together, we were responsible to each other to be careful outside the hospital. And I, for one, did get COVID and had a tremendous amount of guilt worrying about whether I would have passed it on to my team members, which fortunately didn't happen. But that's another thing, you know, when you still have to go to work and you're still working closely with people, what are you doing to keep yourself safe so that you keep your coworkers safe?
We huddled around phones together almost constantly.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think that's really powerful. And something that you mentioned, which is really interesting, is sort of that you weren't involved in certain policy changes. And right. I know that during COVID, policy change it happened just so frequently. And so what was that like for the two of you in terms of trying to keep up to date, not only with the policy changes for you, but also to adequately and correctly inform families what those changes were and what the new visitation policy was, or things like that? Because I know, you know, from prior research that institutional policy change also has an impact on moral distress. If you tell the family the wrong thing or something incorrectly that has changed, that has deep impacts on you as an individual.
We learned early on that the charge nurse or the nurse manager are the final say on what's allowed for visitation.
Of the
So-
day on each floor.
Yeah, so it was a constant deferring to the people who make the decisions. And we often felt like we could advocate that it would be beneficial for them to come and see their loved one through the glass even. And then all the time sort of let that responsibility go because it wasn't up to us. And we could say we will advocate for your ability to visit, but it isn't up to us. Because if you feel like you're promising something really important to be able to say, yeah, we're gonna try to get you up here so that you can come and see and hold their hand. But it just was, depending on what unit you were on or the staff that day, it could happen or it could not. So I felt like we early on found that new kind of script to say, so we're going to advocate for your ability to visit, but it is not up to us ultimately. And we defer to the staff that are on the unit and we'll have them call you. And they were most of the time, I think, really understanding. And if the answer was no or yes, they will call the family and inform them of why.
And we're talking, of course, about the non-COVID patients because there was no visitation for the COVID patients.
Right. No, thank you for that clarification. And Gabrielle, I'm wondering, as a nurse and being a nurse on the floor, what your experiences was like with the policy changes and trying to be, open with families who wanted to visit, right, or who were calling daily to find out what was going on with their, family member, loved one, because I'm sure that phone calls definitely increased in trying to get a sense of those day-to-day updates.
We immediately adopted a change in our routine where we usually have physician rounds in the morning every day where we discuss a plan of care. So after we finished the physician rounds, we call the family to give them an update. And then halfway through the shift, we inform them that probably around 4 o'clock, anywhere between 4 to 5 o'clock, we are going to give them another update about, what's going on. And of course, we reassure the family that if any changes, we will contact them right away. We kept our word about that because, of course, everybody was so eager to find out what's going on. And soon our administration has provided us with iPads and extended electronic devices, and we were able to connect the families. We were placing, the iPad in the patient's room. We established, of course, hygiene procedures, how to clean, how to take care of this, because we avoid transmission of germs. And we offer the family the possibility to see their loved ones for 30 minutes every day by placing this iPad at the bedside. The difficulty arises when a lot of people could not understand why they are talking, and the patient does not talk back because they were intubated. And then, of course, we had to do a lot of education about that. We extended all that with the help of our palliative care. We even had family meetings at the bedside through the iPad, where we could actually allow more than one family member, to see their loved ones through the iPad. And that was such a relief because they were able to have some type of contact, to be able to see their loved ones. The difficulty occurred when the nurse was too busy and could not, follow the schedule on these calls. And then we asked other members of the team to help. And so we can facilitate all these conversations and all these visits. So the families have some type of ability to see their patients. When the end of care decisions were coming around, and it was obvious that the end was very close, we allowed the family to come, 2 members at a time, for 15 to 30 minutes. We had the help of clergy that we trained how to put their equipment, and even the respirators, the masks, and so on, to give them, to anoint and to give a final rite. We taught them how to, wash their hands, what to do, how to put on and off equipment. As we moved through with the pandemic, we felt more comfortable doing all this, and giving closure to the family gave us closure that we've contributed to the well-being and of the families and help the patients on their last encounter with their loved ones. Not a very easy decision to make. A lot of patients had children, and that was obviously not allowed in ICU. We usually do not allow children in ICU, and that was very difficult. But for the sake of maintaining a sense of humanity, first of all, and at the same time making sure everybody stays healthy, we had to help everybody, put the equipment on and help them get this final visit.
No, I appreciate that, and thank you so much for sharing sort of those experiences for you and for patients and families in terms of that closure. And what I'm imagining now is that there must have been so much to do in terms of making that happen, right? Not only for you, but in order to talk to the clergy, in order to talk to the physicians, in order to talk to administration, to make sure that it's okay, that the families come and visit. And I'm sure with COVID-19, this is really heightened sort of making sure we really have transparent interdisciplinary communication. And so I want to reach out to the ethicists first, either Dr. Rubin or Dr. Malik, who want to take it, in terms of how do we think about interdisciplinary communication about these advanced care plans, and how is this heightened during COVID-19? Because I can see disagreements between patients and families and healthcare teams, advancing, but I can also see that with some people working remote, some people not, that there really has to be sort of transparent communication. That can also get lost when we're worried about our own personal health, as well as the health of our patients, as well as the health of families. And I'm wondering, as an ethics committee or as an ethicist, how you go about, because as an ethicist, you're really sort of that mediator between patients and families and healthcare teams and sort of everybody. And so how do we go about thinking about, effective communication in the time of COVID-19 when it comes to end of life care?
Do you want to go ahead, Dr. Malik? Okay. So to me, the only way to resolve a challenging situation is through a multidisciplinary approach. Period. I could come in and have the most sound ethical analysis and write in the chart, this is the truth, this is who's right, this is incorrect, here are some other ways. I can give you 50 references, but if we haven't taken into account the perspective of the family, the patient, the bedside nurse, the chaplain, palliative care, the surgeon, the intensivist, if all these people haven't had a chance to discuss their perspective, what they see the barriers are to resolving the situation, it's just not going to happen. And so, especially places that have a well-developed palliative care group, I think that importance of being a mediator and a communicator has risen significantly. Because most of the time when people call an ethicist, you know, they have a pretty good idea of how things usually run and what's supported. They may have trouble articulating it and finding the principle that backs it up. But that's what we're there for, is to help bring those things out in the conversation, let everyone have a chance to be heard and come to a consensus resolution. And so there is no ethical pixie dust. There is no quick cure. It's conversations, it's meetings. And sometimes that means realizing someone is dancing around what they want to say and kind of suggesting that they may be thinking something, trying to pull that out into the ether. So they feel it's okay to be honest about how they feel and what they think, and then moving things forward.
Yeah, I completely agree that those meetings, joint interdisciplinary group meetings, are the most effective, most efficient way of getting things done. Maybe not the most efficient for the person who has to try to organize them, but most efficient for everybody else. I will say a couple of things. We got very good at WebEx, running, having those meetings over WebEx. And because of the pandemic, everybody was home all the time, pretty easy to reach. So they were fairly easy to coordinate compared to, normal life. So that was one small upside. I think my perspective as a clinical ethicist, my practice is to always know what everybody is going to say before we walk into the meeting. So I try to talk to each of the participants individually so I can see where they're coming from, where the potential conflicts might be, to get any additional information if I need it. If I know that this person's really hung up on the patient's neuro status, even though the ICU team doesn't think that the neuro status is relevant, I'm still going to try to get a neurologist there because I know that's what's going on with the family. So understanding where everyone is coming from and then being able to sort of facilitate that conversation with everybody in the room together is definitely an important tool in the toolbox. It doesn't always work, but I
appreciate both of your responses. And I'm looking to Jeannie and Emily, as a chaplain and a social worker, I know that sometimes those interdisciplinary conversations can not include you all sometimes. And so I'm wondering what your experiences have been in terms of sort of creating those interdisciplinary conversations too, especially during COVID-19.
I think that our focus is so different because a clinician is trying to convey the medical perspective or what's happening with this medication or this machine with this condition. And I know our palliative care MPs, I often see them, their brains functioning at such a high level to try to convey all of the things that they want to convey, all of this incredible education and information. But if I sometimes look over at the family, you can see they checked out completely. They stopped listening a long time ago. So our roles are different enough that I think just observing the dynamics of the room and the space and how the family presents themselves or the way they communicate, and helping to kind of try to state the obvious sometimes and just bridge that gap, because we have incredible nurse practitioners and physicians who have so much to offer and who are big-hearted, but their function is so different. So
I think we have what Michael alluded to as a very well-established palliative care team, and at least one of our disciplines is almost always included in the on those conversations. Ethics is run separately from the palliative care team.
They coincide a lot.
They coincide, but they're technically two different things.
Yeah.
No, I appreciate that. And, in looking at the time, I want to make sure that we leave, about a half hour for questions and whatnot from our attendees. But I have two kind of final questions. And one of them is, so we've talked about moral distress. We've talked about this interdisciplinary communication, obviously trying to get everybody in the room. But what are some ways that we can think about institutionally to alleviate moral distress? Because in our last panel, we talked a lot about, those individual self-care strategies. I know Gabriella has talked about mindfulness and all those kind of things that folks tend to do on their own time, give themselves a vacation, take time away from work. But what do we think that as an organization or an institution that you would want to see, or that you have thoughts about in terms of making sure that we are going to be there for our providers, whether that's direct care providers like nurses and physicians, or allied health professionals, or even our ethicists, where we're thinking about those long-term impacts of the pandemic on our providers. And as Dr. Rubin alluded to, this grief and this trauma that we've all kind of experienced in terms of our own personal health, but also the health and illness and death that we've bared witness to. So I don't know who wants to start, but I want each panelist to kind of talk a little bit about that.
I'll start. I think Texas Health, at least here, Emily and I were talking about this yesterday, started us off with enough PPE. When there was all the conversation nationally about not enough PPE, we always had PPE. So we started out from a place where we felt taken care of by our organization. And then they set up, we had some reflective listening sessions. There's monthly self-care webinars, and we processed a lot as a team. I think those were important things.
Emily, do you add anything?
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
You go ahead.
So when we're talking about moral distress, right? I mean, there's a lot of distress around COVID in all kinds of distress. Really, when we're talking about moral distress in particular, we're kind of thinking of situations in which people are forced to, or sort of coerced into, participating in something that they don't want to participate in, or they're not able to do what they believe is the morally correct thing. And I think one way institutions can help to work with clinicians is to make sure they understand why they're doing what they're doing, especially in a pandemic. There's a lot of times when we're not doing our normal practice, and that feels wrong. So we can feel like there's moral distress associated with that. And if the institution can do a good job of explaining, this is why we have these policies, this is why we're doing things. For example, if the triage policies had to be widely implemented, right? To be very transparent about that and say, this is normal times, this is crisis times, our ethics change, this is why we're doing what we're doing. And it feels like you might feel moral distress, but don't, because it's actually the right thing to be doing. To kind of explain at that higher level, I think that can help. We've had a couple of debriefs of ethics consults where there's been a lot of moral distress. And when the ethics team has gone in and said, this is why we did it, and this is why it was acceptable, they actually felt a lot better. That's not going to deal with all kinds of distress, but it can help at least with moral distress in certain situations.
Yeah, I think we've, what's helped out a lot at our institution is there's been a lot of attention and effort given to communication and transparency from leadership. I think when we're asking people working at the bedside to be taking risks that they are not used to, or working hours that they're not used to, we've had weekly briefings from our president, Dan Podolsky, as well as regular sessions from the head of our health system, John Warner, which have detailed that, yes, these are challenging times. This is what we know. This is what we're concerned about. These are the efforts we're going to take. These are the thresholds for things going back to normal. And I think just that, that reassurance that we don't know all the answers at every moment, but we're going to keep pivoting and making changes, using data, contributing to the community, has done a lot. And when people are experiencing uncertainty, to know that we have advanced systems that are focusing on answering those questions and adapting to the circumstance has done a lot for helping our staff feel supported. Coincidentally, the pandemic has seemed to come out at the time that the wellness movement has really overtaken the country, the recognition that a balanced, healthy, resilient provider is good for patient care. And that is key. It could not have come out at a better time to recognize that we can't just say, this is your duty, do your job. We have to recognize, yes, this is asking a lot from you, and here are the resources, and here's the EAP, and here are the chaplains, and here's your moral distress support group. And thankfully, I think institutions have built in that support structure just in time for the challenges of the pandemic.
I appreciate that. And Gabriella, do you want to chime in?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. So piggybacking on what Dr. Malik said and my Emily about PPE, we are also offered disposable scrubs. We didn't have to, every time we came to work, we were provided with clean, fresh scrubs that, you know, the institution take care of it. We didn't have to carry at home the equipment from the uniforms from work. And then regarding the support that we received, I just want to recognize that you know, the chaplaincy and the social workers from the palliative care have not only dealt with the families, they dealt with us a lot. The palliative care team basically spent a long time on the floor, on the unit, making sure that we are also okay. And after every single encounter, we had conversations, we had the briefing, where just like Dr. Malik said, well, we discussed why we did what and why we said what we said. And that helped understand and creating a safe environment. We were reassured that what we did was the best we could do. And that helped with the morale and with helped us keep going on a daily basis. We also supported each other. If somebody you know, needed a shift off because they could not come to work anymore, we called administration and said, hey, we need some help. And we tried to provide the person that needed some time off with the adequate time off so they can put themselves together and then come back and help us. We did help colleagues who were tested COVID positive and they could not come to work, you know, they had to be in quarantine and so on. And we had help with somebody who came and picked up the extra shift or the shift that were not covered and did not create a burden where somebody had to come to work day in and day out and exhaust themselves in this type of intense emotional environment. Kudos to Emily.
And I think you both bring up, I mean, you and Dr. Malik both bring up a really important point about this debrief, right? And these support groups. And I think one of the things that we want to think about is that in order to do the debriefs and these support groups is there has to be some level of identifying that moral distress is happening, right? Acknowledging that that's happening. And so I think my final question is really, if we could leave, I know there's a lot of social work students and nursing students on there, is what are those aspects that they need to look for in terms of, well, this is moral distress, this is what's going on. What are those either symptoms or implications or like sort of warning signs that say, this is, you need to address this, you need to identify that. And I'm wondering if Dr. Rubin, if you want to start us off.
I really liked it at the beginning when you said that icky feeling. You know, I think that I think we could all relate to when you're aware of a new task and you feel that sense of pressure and time limit versus a request, a piece of information coming across your view, and it just doesn't track. It doesn't seem right, and that's usually your internal compass saying, I don't know if this is what we ought to be doing. And so the key is, recognizing that. When is this simply I'm working hard and there's a lot being asked of me, versus this is an appropriate ask. It's a fair thing for them to want me to do, but the stress I'm feeling is because it might not be what I would choose to do myself. And so once you've separated those two stresses, you can figure out the correct way of handling it. The first may be, do I need better time management or to ask a colleague for help? And the second is, do I need someone to help me process this situation to make sure that I can come to terms with what we're up against so I can continue to take care of my patient.
Thank you. Dr. Malik.
Since I haven't really been a care provider in the same way as many of you all, I'm not sure I've experienced moral distress in the same way. So I'm not sure I would know necessarily how to identify it.
Can I then jump in and say, what do you notice as the person who does debriefings and as the person who's kind of there in the room? What have you noticed? What are those common, I would say, like themes or patterns as a researcher that, come up for you that you've seen, nurses and social workers and interdisciplinary team members talk about? What are those like recurring issues where you say, we need to jump in, we need to have a debrief session?
I think anytime a nurse expresses like serious concerns to an ethics person, there must be some moral distress there, because the bar, I think, for doing that tends to be pretty high. So if I'm hearing concerns, I know that they have a lot of moral distress, and pretty much anytime they raise that, I will take it seriously. There's a few exceptions to that, nurses that just feel very comfortable, they know us, and they're just like, hey, just want to flag this for you. But a lot of times that's not the case. Most of the time it is because they feel a deep concern and unsettled. They feel unsettled about the way things are proceeding. So yeah, I mean, at the debriefs, it's usually just asking questions, and they kind of ask it in a way where they don't want to be threatening, but they are just like, why are we doing this? Like, which is a legitimate question, like, help me understand this. But they have kind of come to a conclusion in their head, I think, but they ask it as a question. I don't think they really are asking the question. I think they really are trying to raise it as a concern.
I think that's helpful. And then Emily and Jeannie, since you're both on the same video.
I think it's a sense that identifying moral distress within yourself has to do with when you go to physically care for this person in the bed and you feel like you're just hurting them. And that's the things that you have to do to them is just painful. It's only hurt. And there's not a clear reason that it makes sense to do these things. The other thing too that I saw kind of peak was a sort of overwhelming, dual purpose. So I'm doing the physical work of being the nurse, but I also feel very responsible for talking to the family on the phone to explain and paint the picture like Gabriella was describing of what we're doing for their loved one. And then also why it doesn't make sense, because they will probably not make it. And I felt like there were times where feeling that I have to wear these two hats was just too much. And I think that's where we were seeing a lot of people retiring early, leaving to find a new job, and just kind of checking out, because you can't really have the task to keep this dying person alive, and then also try to comfort their family. It's a lot to deal. So I think seeing, I guess, as well, just that from the outsider perspective too, but seeing that kind of full weight just sitting on someone's shoulders.
I have to agree. I think the biggest moral distress was from the staff at bedside who had to continue to treat patients and felt they were doing more harm than good, and their hands were tied. It's a terrible thing to watch. And in retrospect, since we were all going through it together, I know this happened on our team, there kind of became some form of compassion fatigue, because everybody's going through it, and you can only support each other so much while you're trying to keep yourself above water. And I don't know about for Emily, but as an allied professional, sometimes it's so hard to be the observer of the stress that's going on, and we don't have any control over the care plan for the patient.
Acknowledging your own grief.
Yeah. And Gabriella, do you want to chime in as sort of the nurse that everybody's talking about?
Recognizing your own grief, I think it's the most important thing for the caretaker. Being there for your co-workers, it's also important. You know, when you talk to somebody and all of a sudden they start crying, or they just say, I'm sorry, I have to take a moment, and you realize that they're going through a hard day. And then I think the most difficult is to keep your composure when you talk about things that you recognize that, like the other panelists said, you're not going to go anywhere. You're just coming closer to the other end of the bridge, and that end is not, where the sun is. So that's where the moral distress sets in. Have we been through this? Yes. How did we cope? We just talked about. You have to talk about until, everybody is aware and everybody acknowledges and everybody has the strength to say, yes, we recognize this. And all those white ribbons that I talked about in the beginning were, you concentrate on, put all your bad thoughts and you put that ribbon on, and you think that ribbon is going to help you get away with, your thoughts will go away with that ribbon, and you hang it somewhere, and all the bad things are just over there, and you pay your tribute, and you are now free to move on. It's a lot of symbolism in this gesture. It's a lot of mindfulness, if you want, in this gesture, but man, it was so helpful.
No, thank you. It does sound like it was really helpful to sort of everybody involved in the healthcare setting. And I know I said that was my last question, but you raised a really interesting point for me. So I'm going to keep asking questions, but I do have one more, and this is in relation to sort of moral distress and advanced care planning. So in our pre-work, for those who are attending this, there is a link to the state of Texas Health Department that has links on how you could fill out your medical power of attorney, your directive to physician, if that is something that you want to do after this conversation. But knowing that we have a lot of students, knowing that we probably have some early on practitioners, what's kind of one piece of advice, one thing to consider kind of going into the field and thinking through all this? Because I don't want to end on sort of a down note of these are all the moral distress things that can happen. These are all our grief and loss and bereavement. And I know we talked about ways to alleviate and debrief about moral distress, but what are some practical strategies in terms of going into the field during a pandemic, and sort of things to look out for, but also how to prepare yourself, and sort of that one piece of advice, that one good thing that's sort of happening that you're able to provide either to patients and families, something good that's happened in your hospital setting or something within your professional capacity that you see as, you know, help as part of the helping profession. And that's sort of something I want to end on, because I want to end on, you know, resiliency and strength and the incredible work that our frontline workers are doing. And that includes, I include ethicists and frontline practitioners as well. So with our frontline workers, in terms of how have you helped patients and families, and what are some benefits about being on the front line? So I guess we can start with Gabriella, since you ended our last one of starting us off with just some final.
Just want to tell all the students, nursing students out there, and all the healthcare workers out there that nursing is a teamwork. You're not alone. You're never alone. Your teamwork is there for you at any step of the way. I think when you go when you face a pandemic, every day is a new day. You have to start fresh. And don't think that, oh my God, last shift I lost a patient. No, today is a new day and you start fresh. It's just, that helps you going a lot. And then always talk with your coworkers, with your team, and that helps a lot. Make a plan, involve the team in conversation, the daily visits, the daily rounds, make a plan, and that motivates a lot in what you're doing. And look at the bright side, you know, there's always everything comes to an end. It's important to make sure, you know, you do you use all your skills and everything you've learned to provide care to these patients, and here's the additional families and everything. We've learned now how to cope and how to involve people and how to use technology. We haven't done that before. So now everything is possible. And here we are now. COVID patient is a rare case, and that's such a big victory. Celebrating victories is also very important. That's from my point of view.
That's really true, to celebrate this, even if there's small victories, to celebrate.
Exactly.
Emily, and then Jeannie, do you want to go?
I try to tell families who are, I mean, we call and we break their hearts and we ruin their day, and these are the worst days of their lives, and we support them through. And I think just the coverage of the pandemic and the way we were celebrating frontline workers so much, we were thanked profusely. People were so incredibly thankful. They bought our unit meals, they sent gifts, and the families were and have and continue to be so appreciative of everything that we're doing, which seems so counterintuitive because we're the ones breaking their hearts too at the same time. But they know that we're here taking care of their loved one and supporting them, and it's a huge gift to have that be received. You know, have people acknowledge that the words that you're saying or the presence that you're providing, the care that you're giving, makes an enormous difference in their lives and will be part of the story they always tell here on out. That the team called me this day, and that's when I realized that he was not going to make it, and that nourishes that. It does help to reinvigorate and just remind me of why I want to be here. Another gift ultimately is seeing how people feel like they literally cannot do this. This is the hardest thing. They cannot do this. They can't make this decision, or they can't face this reality. And then over the course of time, seeing them find the strength within themselves is forever in all ways the most incredibly rewarding thing. To watch human resilience and strength just explode when they really need it to happen. It's a beautiful thing to see, and it'll always inspire
Well, I think from a social work perspective, we look for strengths. And so a lot of what Emily says is what I said was what I was going to say is we're seeing families at their worst times and they're acknowledging our strength. And we're able, and I would tell new social workers to see the strengths in the family as they make these decisions and are able to move forward, even if it was very rough getting there. We were lucky enough to have a social work student through this process. Yeah. And to watch her grow and understand and absorb how families go from denial to rationalizing to acceptance and then back and forth, and was just a beautiful thing.
Dr. Malik.
So I guess on a little sort of a different level, one sort of positive of all of this has been the conversations that have been taking place about ethics. Well, there's been a lot more thought about ethics, and I think that our hospital has, different hospitals have different ethics programs that are, at different stages of development. But I'm sure for any of them, they are feeling the need for a little more ethics in their lives than before the pandemic, and so. I think that has been sort of good for the field of clinical ethics, and also it's been good for our own. We have a very well established service, but it has been a huge learning opportunity for us to think through the processes that we had been using. How can we make them better? How can we make them, meet the needs of our patients, of our providers better? And how can we get better integrated into the organization? So that's sort of maybe a self-serving upside, but it's interesting sort of from my position as an ethicist to see how it has sort of invaded. I mean, it's like much more of a common conversation within the hospital, but even just within the world. So it's interesting.
No, thank you for that. And I agree that it's raised a lot of questions regarding ethics. And Dr. Rubin, final words.
So I would say you never know what you're capable of until you're in a situation where you have to adapt and meet the challenge. And I see people all around me that are doing things that they never thought they would experience and show skills and abilities that they didn't realize they had within themselves. So behind me is I don't know if you could tell, but it's a picture of the Phoenix. And so it's kind of a motif that I've really resonates with me these days. Just the concept of having an overwhelming threat and then finding renewal and birth and strength greater than you've had before. And I think we can all find that. We can't forget the challenges we've been through and the sadness for those that did not make it. But we should honor them. We should honor our grief and our challenges and experience and live even better lives than we ever did before.
Yeah, I think that's really well said and really a great way to sort of end and bring up for questions. So I invite attendees to use the chat or the Q&A box if you have any questions, and over Facebook Live, we are monitoring that as well if you have questions to put into the comments. And again, I am Sophia Fantis. I moderated this panel, and I am an assistant professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Texas at Arlington. I was a clinical ethics postdoc at Houston Methodist and Baylor College of Medicine for 2 years. And my research interests are on moral distress among allied health professionals. And I'm currently doing a study looking at moral distress among chaplains and social workers in the time of COVID-19 on their experiences of moral distress. So that's a little bit about my background. I realized I didn't say that at the beginning. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to contact me for more information about that. And I will turn it over to Becky with any final words or comments. I know a couple of people had questions about the pre-work, so maybe we can just do that very briefly, and I will give time for participants to have some questions.
All right. Well, Dr. Fantis, thank you very much for your moderator duties.
I also see that somebody says, totally unrelated, I hear a baby. Congratulations. I am so sorry, everybody. I was hoping that nobody would hear him, but I do have a newborn in my lap who is a month old. And so I've been trying to and he was supposed to be asleep, but if obviously he woke up in the middle and needed to be fed. And so I apologize for that. I hope that was not too distracting, but he
No,
so
not
I
at all.
apologize for that. But yes, you are not hearing things. There is a baby in the background who is very unhappy right now.
You did a great job. I had no idea. I saw the bottle. I saw like the bottle.
Of it all. No, I'm kidding.
Oh, he's such a trooper.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful. Well, Dr. Fannis, thank you again for moderating and weaving in the threads and the comments, and the flow was just awesome. I want to thank our panelists, but before we do that, I am going to encourage any of our participants out there, if you've got any questions, to put those in the chat board, and we'll kind of keep.
I do see a question right now, and this is: how does one get into clinical ethics, and what attributes do you think are necessary for being in your role? Do you want me to take it?
Yeah, do you want to go ahead, Sophia? You've just done that.
I can comment, and then we can bring in Dr. Rubin and Dr. Malik. How does one get into clinical ethics? The great thing that I love about clinical ethics is that it is really any background. It is a purely multidisciplinary field, which creates such incredible dialogue and conversations and different perspectives. So when I was a postdoc in clinical ethics, I was the only social worker surrounded by philosophers and lawyers. And so it was very interesting to have those conversations. But if you're interested in clinical ethics, I suggest looking, if you're interested in like the educational route, I would look at master's programs. You don't necessarily have to, you should have a final degree as either an MD or a law degree or a PhD. But you can really look at sort of clinical master's programs or even postdoc programs that can help to train you as a clinical ethicist. There's a lot of new programs out there now. It's becoming very, very popular and a hot topic. So I got into it, a little bit about my background. I got into it, I did, my bachelor's was in religion and bioethics. I then went to do an MSW at New York University. And then after my MSW, I did a collaborative PhD, a joint PhD in social work and bioethics. And so then after my PhD, I then went and did a clinical ethics fellowship where I trained as a clinical ethicist. I am a certified healthcare ethicist. I wrote the exam. So there's that. And then I decided to go back into academia. But from there, I could have also worked at a hospital as a clinical ethicist. And so that's a little bit about my background, but Dr. Malik and Dr. Rubin, I know you have very different backgrounds as well. But Erin, if you are in social work, that was a little bit about my route to go into it. So I didn't do a master's of bioethics, but there's master's programs in bioethics. If you have a PhD, you can do a postdoctoral program or things like that. I really suggest getting training and expertise and mentorship in clinical ethics in order to kind of go into it and become a clinical ethicist. And then what attributes you think are necessary? Crisis intervention and good interpersonal communication skills, and the ability to read nonverbal cues, and the ability to try and get everybody in the same room at the same time. So I guess that goes into interdisciplinary communication skills, but trying to, this is not anything against surgeons, so sorry for any surgeons in the room, but it is almost impossible to get a surgeon in the room if you need them in the room to talk to a patient and family. So if you can do that, you'd be a great clinical ethicist. So that's my joke of the day. But Dr. Malik and Dr. Rubin, I don't know if you want to chime in too, because you also come from very different backgrounds.
I think you laid out the various pathways pretty well. I think the key is that it is a diverse group of people. I would suggest going to a meeting of the American Society of Bioethics and Humanities, the ASBH. If you like academic conferences and you ever wanted to see a wider diversity of people with one common interest, it's that. I mean, you have your social workers, your PhDs, your MDs, your nurses, clergy, you have everyone there. All coming together with this wide variety of interests. you can also just, you know, find a paper, just read about ethics. There's great books out there. You don't have to have formal training in order to be on an ethics committee and try it on for a little bit and see if it suits you, and then later pursue formal training.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, that last one, that there is a huge range of ways that people do clinical ethics. And it has evolved dramatically over the recent years. So it used to be just like whoever was like known as like the good person, that was like the ethics committee, right? Because there wasn't really training, there wasn't any formal mechanisms for this. Now there is a range of training opportunities, from just like intensive courses, like week-long, you know, 2 or 3 days, kind of get a sense of what this whole field is. There are fellowship programs, like as Dr. Fantis was saying, some of them are 1 year, most of them are 2 years, and do require a terminal degree. And that's if you were interested in really being a clinical ethicist, like as a full-time profession. But there's a lot of ways you can get involved without going to that level of sort of being a full-time professional, that have these sort of smaller training courses or things like that. So it depends on your hospital. The large academic medical centers are moving toward having at least one professional ethicist on staff, and then they're supported by other volunteer or part-time folks who maybe have less amount of training. And then smaller community hospitals are still kind of in the where's the good person in the room model, and maybe we'll get that person a little bit of training from here. So it really depends where you are and what your level of interest is.
Okay.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions from our participants? No.
Okay. So I think a lot of information was covered, and answers to questions, you know, conveyed during the conversations as well. So Dr. Fantis and panelists, I thank you all so very much for being a part of part 3. We're so appreciative of your time, your expertise in sharing.
There is one more, sorry to interrupt, Becky. There's
Okay,
one more
thank
question.
you.
What is, and I'm not sure, maybe Glendy can expand on this, but the question is, what is the goal of reaching an ethical decision? So I guess what's the final goal, or what's the objective when you're having these sort of ethical consultations and ethical conversations? What are you looking for as the outcome, is what I assume the question is. They wrote exactly, so.
Yeah, so there's kind of a divergence in the field about this. Sort of the old school way is that the goal of the decision of the ethics consultation is to give the correct answer, like what is the ethically defensible solution, and here is the answer, and you're expected to do it. That's more of the old school way. The new school way tends to be much more about communication and mediation, sort of getting people in the room, having those conversations. And some people have gone to as far as the extreme of saying, really, the ethicist role is not to bring in normative judgments, which I personally think is wrong as somebody who trained as an ethicist, that really their goal is just to sort of get everybody in agreement, and then that's fine. I think that really it is about 50-50 in my experience, like about half of the time. It's just a communication issue that we need to get everybody, they're feeling an ethical dilemma, but it's a result of miscommunication that we can solve that way. And then about another 50% of the time, it's actually bringing in like ethical analysis and saying, this is what you could do, and this is how you would justify it from an ethics perspective.
Dr. Rubin, do you have anything to add as an ethicist?
No, I think that's accurate. I'm also of the mindset of helping people navigate towards a solution that everyone can get behind, but it also needs to be ethically sound. And I think there's usually enough viewpoints and opinions in the room that you can work towards it. It just helps to understanding the principles that guide it, so you can augment one or two views that are probably more in line with the ethical consensus.
No, I appreciate that. And somebody just wrote that they just updated their living will. So I think that connects to like our conversation before of our preferences, our values, our wishes might change, especially during the pandemic, but also based on lived experiences, maturation, development, talking about these type of things. And so there's no expiration date, I would say, on a living will. So make sure yours are updated with current wishes and values and things like that. So that's great. And then Becky, maybe you can answer this question. There's a question on how to access the previous panels.
Yes, School of Social Work has a YouTube channel, and those have been placed on their YouTube channel.
You can also view it on our Facebook pages as well.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you. And then just some additional comments of somebody saying, rich information and a lot of food for thought on new career directions, which I had no idea were available. So thank you.
Well, I think at this time, I will go ahead and share the QR code for those of you that have the scanners in your cameras. And I'll bring that up, and we'll keep that up for a bit. And if we have any questions afterwards, you can email me, or Dr. Fannis had put her email up as well. So I'll put mine in.
And I just put mine in the chat as well.
Okay, wonderful. I have actually a question for Dr. Malik and Dr. Rubin, if I may. Years ago, when I was a bedside nurse working in a hospital system, we did have an ethics committee, and there was opportunity for a bedside nurse, I think, to be a part of that. Can you explain in your institutions how the makeup of the committees these days?
Well, at Southwestern, we have shared governance of our
Sure.
clinical ethics committee. So we structurally include nurses in the group. So we report to multiple points of the hospital hierarchy. And this ensures that we keep a multidisciplinary approach to our work.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, ours, I'm not sure that I don't know if we have it self-governance, that's a special word. I'm not familiar with that, but we just make sure that our committee is multidisciplinary. I think we have 4 or 5 nurses on our committee, along with chaplains and social workers and respiratory therapists, and pretty much try to get a representative of just about everybody who is could be involved with patient care.
Thank you. Dr. Fannis, I'll keep the QR code up for a few. It's 3:51, and I'll keep it up for those that are trying to scan or coming back to their screens to do that. We also put the evaluation link in the chat board, but I'll hand it back over to you. And once again, I want to thank our panelists so very much for participating today. Really learned a lot.
Yeah, and that's, Becky, that's how I'll end it too. Thank you so much to our panelists for taking the time on, I know at the end of a semester and on the end of a really hard year to come talk to us. It was really educational and informative and meaningful to, I know, all of us and all the attendees. If anybody has any questions of the attendees or the participants, I put my email in the chat. Feel free to email me or Becky. I know there's a question on asking how they can scan the QR code. So maybe Becky, you can just give a brief
Sure.
explanation on how to scan that. But again, my final words are just thank you so much to the panelists and for everybody coming this afternoon. I know it's a lot to ask of your time, so thank you so much, and feel free to be in touch with me if you're interested more about moral distress or ethics or social work or what have you. So thank you so much, everybody. And thank you, Becky and Tracy, for organizing this and putting this together, and for Coral, who is part of our social work team, for organizing and doing the Zoom links and making sure that we all have our audio and videos working, and we were able to be here today. So thank you to Coral as well for all your amazing work.
Yes. So for the QR code, if you've got an iPhone or an iPad, your camera, all you have to do is turn your camera on and aim it towards the QR code, and it'll you'll get a frame, and then the link will pop open in order for you to complete the evaluation. If it's an Android, you have to have an app, so it may not be as easy to do. We also have put the evaluation link in the chat board. That's something that you can click on to get that evaluation link. And finally, if those don't work, please email becky.baird@uta.edu.
Thanks all.
Okay.